For most of Instagram's existence, it wasn't thought of as a platform for distributing news. But a growing number of media entrepreneurs have figured out ways to leverage its photo and video features to deliver engaging news digests. One of those entrepreneurs is Sam Koslowski. Back in 2017, he and his co-founder launched the Daily Aus, a social-first news outlet that's grown its Instagram account to over 500,000 followers. As it ramped up its audience on the app, it began to diversify its content offerings across newsletters, podcasts, and YouTube. In my interview with Sam, we discussed why Instagram was the ideal platform for launching the company, how it monetizes its content, and where he hopes to expand in the coming years. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. And longtime listeners of this show know that it carries no advertising. The only way to support the painstaking work I do here is by becoming a paid subscriber to my newsletter. Subscribers get a half-hour introductory phone call with me. They also get to submit questions every month that I try my best to answer on this very show. Subscribe at simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with Sam. Hey Sam, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Simon.
So you launched an outlet called the Daily Aus in 2017, but you actually came up with the idea several years earlier, I think while you were traveling in Europe. Can you talk about set the scene and explain how the idea popped into your head?
So I was 18 actually. It was 2013 and I was on my gap year traveling around Europe, and I was on a train going I think it was from Budapest to Rome or the other way around. And I think to set the context, I was always that person that my friends would message saying, hey, I'm about to go on a date. I haven't read any of the news, but I want to sound like I know something. Can you quickly just tell me what's going on in the world? Because everyone knew that I loved the news. And what I noticed
which is a little bit rare when you're 18. I feel like I didn't become more kind of politically aware until I was in my 20s.
Some would even call it nerdy, but it was definitely a odd fascination I had. I come from a family of journalists. I've grown up around newsrooms and around talking about the news, and I just love it so much. And what I noticed was that on social media, other news channels were only using social media as a way to get people to jump onto a website. And I thought, for all my friends who are just trying to get news headlines to sound smart on a date, they don't actually want to take that next step. They just want to be on social media, look at a picture of a friend having a coffee, look at a picture of a landmark, and then read something quickly. So I came up with the idea to kind of use social media as the only place to have the platform. Then I didn't do anything for 4 years, was busy being a young person.
And to set the stage, this was 2013 when, the main two social networks were Facebook and Twitter, and Instagram was around, but it was definitely much more primitive than it is today. I think you could only, share a single photo and maybe a 15-second video at most.
Exactly. But at the same time, as an 18-year-old, it was where all my friends were. So none of my friends were on Twitter or Facebook. They were on this newly emerging social media platform called Instagram. So I saw a massive opportunity there to jump onto it first. It took me 4 years to actually do anything about it, but the idea was there in 2013.
And as you said, you weren't a novice to media. You said your family were journalists. I think you also worked at a news outlet in Australia, right?
Yeah, I worked at there's a very small company. I think you guys might know it overseas as well, called News Corporation. So I worked at Fox Sports for a couple of years. So the day after I finished my final exams in the final year of school, I started as a social media producer there at Fox Sports, and I was there for 5 years all up.
Yeah, and was the main goal with that is as you said, just driving people traffic back to the website? Did your bosses care about did any of their KPIs have to do with actual engagement on the platforms?
There was always one eye on social media growth, but the ultimate goal was to get those page views and to get those page impressions. I mean, that's the whole early model of why social media was useful for news companies, was to keep driving that traffic back. And I worked on some really interesting ideas that were kind of foreshadowing the idea of social media being more of its own feature. We were the first team to put live tweets at the bottom of screens in sports matches in Australia. And so I was part of that production team and that process. And that was the first signal to me that maybe social media could actually have more of a role to play besides just being a top of funnel kind of device to gain an audience.
Yeah. And so you flash forward 4 years, this account has been lying dormant, and
Yeah.
I think you went through a bad breakup. Was that the catalyst?
Heartbroken at I think I was about 22, and my therapist at the time said that I should start a project to take my mind off it. And I thought, I've had that handle, the Daily Aus, for a while now. I think I might do something there. So I went onto LinkedIn and I wrote on LinkedIn, I want to start a media company. Does anyone want to do it with me? Because I just read, I can't remember if it was one of the big kind of business writers. I just read a column about how you need a co-founder. Um, and as a very impressionable 22-year-old with not a hugely developed frontal lobe, I just kind of took that as gospel and did it. And Zara, who we'd grown up in the same community here in Sydney, but we hadn't actually spoken face to face before, she was the only person to reply. And the next week we went for a coffee and had the same love for news and the same vision about serving young people. She was also that friend who people would message saying, I don't understand what's happening in North Korea. Can you quickly tell me what's happening? And the Daily Oz was born. So that was March 2017.
And what was her full name?
Zara Seidler.
And what was her actual? Did she work in journalism?
She was working as a liaison producer, so kind of like a night producer at Sky News, another part of the News Corp empire here in Australia. And then she was also starting to get involved in politics. And so I was kind of thinking about a career in the law. She was thinking about a career in politics. We'd both had this experience in journalism, and we thought we could do it better.
And so you launched in 2017. Was the initial iteration just Instagram?
Yeah, and the initial iteration was actually just Instagram stories. So the idea, Instagram stories were new, and the idea was let's just do a bulletin at 8 a.m. on Instagram stories and see how it works. So we did the top four stories of the day plus one good news story every single day, and then we just started posting some photos to the grid. But it was very slow. It was very, very slow, and it took us 3 years to get. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, like, did the carousel exist yet, or was it like stories was your only option
No.
for posting like several stories?
Exactly. So stories was our only option for getting like some momentum up, and then the carousel wasn't there yet. It was just Instagram frames, and we didn't really know what we were doing. No one in the world thought about using text on Instagram yet. That didn't exist.
Yeah, because I remember a lot of news organizations back then, it would just be like a photo and you had to look in the captions to read the context. And it would be like,
Yeah.
click on bio, so that you would have to do this laborious process of seeing the photo, clicking down to the captions, and then going up to the link in bio if you wanted to read the story. And
Yeah.
then some news organizations started to innovate and actually figure out to basically treat Instagram almost as like presentation slides with like a series of stock images or video with overlaying text, and that's what you were doing with Instagram stories.
Exactly. And so when the carousel kind of arrived onto Instagram, we made a very quick move to there as well. And but by the end of the third year, we only had 4,000 followers. Most of them were our friends and people we knew. But what we did notice, even at those early stages, was if we had a big night and we only got to writing the stories at 8:15 a.m., we'd notice that people would message us saying, "Where are my stories?" And already that sense of routine community habit was already forming with a very small audience.
And so, if I'm doing my math correctly, so you're saying 3 years, 2,000 followers. It sounds like something happened in 2020. Some
Yeah,
kind of
exactly.
major, some kind of major news events, maybe.
I
don't
think you've
know.
heard this story before, but we had an interesting ride in Australia with the pandemic. I'm sure you and your listeners have heard about how Australia was, but there was really really strict lockdowns, some of the strictest in the world. And what that meant was state premiers, so kind of the equivalent of a governor, would stand up on television at 11 a.m. every single day and say, "This is how many cases we have. This is what you're allowed to do," and hold a press conference. And it was the first time that people were engaging in ideas around government and rules and health departments and mandatory vaccines and can I go visit my girlfriend? And we would summarize those press conferences and curate them into those Instagram carousels. And so in the year of 2020, we went from 3 or 4,000 to 40,000. And that's when we made the decision to quit our jobs.
And what was driving that? Like, how were people discovering you? Like, when you're, you got 2,000 people, you're getting up to tens of thousands. Like, was
Yeah.
it in the Discover feed, or what was the mechanism that you were using to get people to actually see your content?
Our dominant growth driver that year was actually in private DMs. So it was actually people sharing these posts in group chats, or sending it to their friend or their parents or somebody. We didn't spend any money at all on marketing or brand awareness or anything. We had a couple of influencers who posted stuff that we had made that made the kind of a bump in growth on a particular day. But for the large part, it was just the one by one kind of sending it to your housemates, and then they would send it on to their cousins, and then they would send it on to their work colleagues, and that real organic growth.
And from there, you said you decided to quit your job. What was so? I think you raised some small amount of money at that point, right?
So we kind of sat down. I was a corporate lawyer by that point. Zara was working in politics, and we kind of sat down and said, "We think there's enough here to do it, to give this a crack. We're young enough. We don't have dependents. Let's give this a go." But the idea of just But the idea of just quitting our jobs and not having an income, was really scary, and we didn't know how we would pay rent and eat food and all those kind of things that humans like to do. So we tried to do a family and friends round, and we raised a small bit of capital to allow us to get a minimum wage for the year and get a desk. And then we quit our jobs on the same day. It was January 5, 2021. And 24 hours later, we had some major event in Washington, I remember. And yeah, the news just kind of kept rolling from then.
And then, so what did quitting your jobs and working on it full time? What did that allow you to do that you weren't able to do before? Like, how did that help you
Mm.
with your growth?
So basically allowed us to really apply. I mean, Zara and I were writing everything at the time, and we were trying to figure out, business models around it, how we could actually make this a viable company. And it just accelerated that process. So we immediately started our newsletter. We immediately started our podcast. We immediately, started thinking about how video and the role that video could play in the business. And so whilst that first month of full-time work was just me and her sitting in a cafe, we quickly built to a team of kind of 5 or 6, um, and started to attract advertisers, and things kind of moved quite quickly. So that year 2021, we went from 40,000 to 200,000 on Instagram by the end of the year.
And so the newsletter that you launched, it took kind of like a morning brew model, right? Where it's like, I'm going to take the news for you, summarize the different points of view, pick the major stories, and kind of have it in kind of like
Yeah,
a loose, kind of casual voice, right?
exactly. And you have to remember as well that the newsletter landscape, even in 2021, was grossly underdeveloped, especially here in Australia. And Morning Brew were kind of leading the way. I was a huge Morning Brew fan, but thought there was nothing like that for news in Australia at the time. We have a very unique format that actually hasn't changed in our newsletter since we started it, which was we kind of give people their own adventure in terms of how much time they've got. So there's sections in the newsletter that says, I've got 10 seconds, I've got 1 minute, I've got 2 minutes, I've got 5 minutes, I've got 10 minutes. And that format really was popular amongst readers. So you could be jumping on a bus and go, yeah, I've got about 5 minutes now. I'll scroll down to that bit of the newsletter, and that's for me.
And how did you move that audience off of Instagram? Like, how did you take those 200,000 followers and start converting them into newsletter subscribers?
So Simon, that is the thing that keeps me up at night. Is how do we build media companies that have a first party audience born on social media without betraying our original mission of just using social media as the top of the funnel. And so the way that we do that is trying to figure out how can we really add value to a social audience by getting them to subscribe to a newsletter. So one of the ways that we do that, for example, is polling. So we'll do a lot of research with our audience on Instagram, and we can get up to 100,000 responses now to a question within 24 hours. It's a really engaged audience, and we'll say to
And
them,
these are the polls you can embed in like stories.
exactly, yeah. So far from scientific, far from census weighted and driven, but not those census weighted polls don't particularly work either. So it's a good sentiment, and the way that we frame it is this is what young Australians are thinking, because 85% of our audience is under 35. It's one of the biggest audiences of young people in the country. So we have some data there. And then we'll say to them, if you want the results of the survey, presented to you and commentated on by a journalist, then we'll do it in tomorrow's newsletter. And that's how we kind of drive traffic there. But also thinking
So
about
they voted in the poll, and then they were invested in the results. So in order to
exactly.
really see the results, they needed to subscribe to the newsletter.
Exactly. And then we'd take them along that journey and say, we're going to talk to the Prime Minister about the results of this poll. And that interview will be on our podcast, and really kind of synthesize our products so that you're feeling part of the Daily Aus community rather than just an Instagram page.
And what kind of spikes would you see from those polls, like in terms of signups for the newsletter?
A couple of thousand in a go. So yeah, fast forward to today, we've got a newsletter audience of close to 150,000 people, one of the biggest in Australia, and super engaged. And the interesting thing about the newsletter audience, which bucks the industry trend, is that our newsletter audience is actually younger than our Instagram audience. And so it really challenges this idea of, do young people use email? And in our experience, the answer is a resounding yes.
Yeah, I feel like there was like you're a little bit younger than me, but like 10 years ago, there were all these trend pieces about the end of email and would young people even use email, or would they just use messaging apps? But I feel like that verdict has been rendered that email is never, or at least no time soon, is going away.
No way. No way. As long as people use emails for work or for university, or, to register for loyalty points at their favorite burger shop, as long as there's any way to get on an email, then they'll use it.
Especially since like so many messaging apps don't have any cross functionality. So if work organization A and work organization B are using different services, you need some compatibility between those two things. So that's why email continues to be the killer app. So you were growing the newsletter. You said, and then with the podcast. Is it like reading a script that's based on the daily newsletter? Is it kind of just taking a version of the newsletter and making an audio version of it? Or I know that you have like two hosts for the podcast, or is it more like a talky discussion type podcast?
Yeah. So no two products are the same. So we don't cover something in the podcast the same way we cover it in the newsletter, because they're inherently different mediums. But the podcast is me and Zara still. So we started the podcast 2021. We're still doing it every single day, even though we're now a little busier. And we've been able to upskill a team around us. So now we've got a full-time producer and all that kind of stuff. But it's basically a recap of the day's stories really quickly, and then a deep dive into one topic. But it's no longer than about 10 minutes. And we haven't dropped out of the top 10 for news podcasts in Australia since we started. So we kind of float around that top 10.
That's amazing. I know that like Australia has been a little bit behind the US on the podcast game in terms of maturation of the market. Do you feel like you kind of just like were there early enough to where you were able to benefit from that, basically? Because there probably weren't that many daily podcasts at the time.
No, and fast forward to now, and there are heaps of daily podcasts even in Australia. I mean, every single news channel has their own daily podcast. Every single news publication has multiple iterations of a daily podcast. So it is a very heavily saturated market. It's also a really hard market to have those major spikes of growth in. I mean, it's a hard slog, podcasting, and I find it a little less easy to figure out than the algorithms of social media or even email growth and newsletter growth.
Sure. I mean, it's a more consistent audience. I feel like it's because there's so much more friction to subscribing to a podcast for the most part versus something trending on Instagram or something like that. So but the growth itself is a lot slower.
I think it's also interesting to note that, like, my 19-year-old brother, all of his friends don't listen to podcasts. It's not part of their daily habits as well. So yeah, depending on the interpretation you take of young people, we still haven't gotten an answer for, are the 16 to 20-year-olds listening to podcasts with the same aggression as 24 to 30-year-olds?
Yeah, I certainly think that like most young people, if they're listening to a podcast, they're really kind of just watching it on YouTube. Like they're
Yeah,
watching,
or TikTok.
you know,
Yeah,
Logan Paul or Marcus Brownlee or people like that who,
exactly.
you
I
know,
agree with you.
are posting like video versions of it. And maybe then they start dallying in the audio version because they found out about it on YouTube.
Yeah, and I think we'll see podcast apps really embed video as almost a mandatory part of the offering in the very near future.
Yeah. So then you also launched on TikTok and you said you started to just experiment with video. Tell me about what your video strategy is.
Well, I think the thing that we're really trying to bring to video is, and this is kind of what we're trying to bring to every platform, is can we embed the same quality journalism strategies that newsrooms have used since the print newspaper for these modern audiences? So just because it's on TikTok, does that mean it's not fact checked? Does that mean it's not editorially independent? Does that mean that it doesn't have the kind of weight of thought behind it that a written piece should? So we've got TikTok. We upload a couple of pieces a day. Every single one of them is we're really proud of the editorial product, and that's what we thought was missing. Newsrooms were kind of rushing through TikToks and not giving them as much thought, but that audience deserves quality journalism as well. And so that's what we've really tried to bring to the platform and done a good job.
Hey, I just want to interrupt the programming for just a moment to note that you are at the halfway point of the video. If you made it this far, then that's probably a sign that you like this sort of content. So maybe just take a second to subscribe to the channel below. If you're feeling especially generous, you can hit the like button. Okay, back to the show. And is it like what you were doing with the carousels, except moving pictures instead of still frames? So it's like like stock, or not stock footage, but licensed footage of something like with the terrorist attack in Israel, like, you know, news footage of it with text over it, or is there a narrator or?
There's a narrator. So her name's Chloe. She's our full-time TikToker. She's 21. And she's on a really wonderful kind of journalism journey. And the thing that she tries to bring to our audience is the general narrative is you've seen these headlines around. You've heard your parents talk about this at the dinner table. Let's explain it. And that goes to a key principle of the Daily Aus, which is that just because you're starting to read the news today doesn't mean you should feel behind. It's okay to enter the news cycle on, you know, today in October in 2023, having not read anything else, and you'll be able to get the explanation of the key ideas from us.
Mhm. And so you have like 500,000 followers on Instagram, I think 100,000 on TikTok, and then you said 150,000 on your newsletter. Did you ever do much with Twitter at all?
Never touched Twitter.
Really? Wow.
Ever. No. I mean, that's partly to do with resources, I think, and just how many goddamn things can we upload something on when news breaks. But we asked our audience early on, and we asked them every year, where are you? What platforms are you using? And consistently, the answer has never been Twitter. So that is just the characteristics of the 18 to 30-year-old Australian audience. They're not on Twitter. I am, you know, a big Twitter reader. I'm not a tweeter myself, but I am on the app every single day. But my friends aren't. And so just because something is traditionally where journalism lives, that's not necessarily a condition for us.
What about Threads? Like, I know it's been blocked in the EU, but I know in the US you can basically port your Instagram following over to Threads. I don't know if is that true in Australia as well?
Yeah, Threads had a really magical kind of 10 days after it launched. And everyone rushed over, and everyone was trying to figure out, oh, we can be a bit cheekier here. And the national broadcaster here in Australia was making kind of wise guy jokes, and it was all quite fun. But then we just saw a massive die off in the engagement of the platform. And I know it's not a very sexy answer, but through all of this, Instagram has just remained as popular as ever. And I've read all the articles about the death to Instagram, and they're probably written by the same people who wrote the death to email. And we're just not seeing that. In fact, we're seeing an acceleration on Instagram, especially now that they've incorporated events as well.
What does that mean?
So they've taken the best bit of Facebook, which we all loved, which is that you can have a house party and have a Facebook event, and they're now going to embed that into Instagram. And I think it's being piloted in Australia, and people are loving it.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember there was like a 5-year period when every event I got invited to was a Facebook event, and I feel like it's been years and years since the last time I got an invite via Facebook.
Yeah.
I didn't know that about Instagram. Yeah, I would give Threads another try. Like there was that sharp drop off, and I think a lot of people tested it and then left. But I think there's been a huge uptick in engagement just in the last few weeks or so as they've been adding new features. So you might want to continue testing content
And it
there.
has
So
the
yeah,
might of Meta behind it as well, and they'll keep plugging it as well. So I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
yeah. So what about monetization? Like you were completely monetized through ads, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we know, again through research, we know that young people are not willing to pay for news. And remember, it's the audience of young people who are just in the door of reading news. They found us by accident and they're just learning the value of news. So 70% of our audience, and we're reaching about 1.5 million people a month, 70% of the audience says we are their primary source of news. So it's a very, not disengaged, but it's a very kind of low consuming news audience. So we know they won't pay for it. How can we do it with ads? We try and figure out ways to partner with brands, government, whoever, who really align with our audience's values. And we never let our editorial integrity waver in what we do with that brand. So lots of clear labeling, lots of kind of Chinese walls between the processes. A brand can't review what we've done and then say, no, I don't like that line, take it out, or anything like that. It's quite strict. And that's taken a lot of brands to get used to. And we lose a lot of deals over brands who want us to be a little more flexible in what we can say about their products. But it's a no go zone for us because, trust in media is at an all time low. In the English speaking world, Australia actually has the lowest trust levels of any other country. And in Australia, young people have the lowest trust levels of any other audience. So if we start kind of embedding ourselves with native advertising and with, branded messaging in articles or writing articles, then it's just not going to work. And the clear example that I have is that when COVID happened and everyone was getting vaccinated, we'd write these articles about AstraZeneca vaccines. And it was a big thing in Australia that young women shouldn't be getting the vaccine because it can cause a lot of harm. And we would talk to scientists, get the research going, and write really simple explainers. And people would message us saying, "Did AstraZeneca pay you for these articles?" And so the ability for us to say no, and you'll know 100% of the time when a brand is paying us to do anything, was a real point of strength.
And like, where's the most demand for ads? Is it the newsletter, the Instagram account, the podcast, the TikTok account? Like, where when you're talking to these advertisers, where are they constantly honing in on? Is this is where I want my ad to be?
I feel like when we go to market with our suite of products, the podcast, for some reason, is always the one that kind of people understand the easiest. I've heard a podcast ad before, that would be easy. The most effective one by far is newsletters. And the problem that we're having at the moment is that we just don't have enough inventory to offer. And so, we're sold out on everything until February next year. Um, and we don't want to oversaturate the audience with ads. And so we're working out now, how do you scale a business? Besides putting your rates up, how do you scale a business when you're meeting the demand of advertisers? The newsletter click-through rates are huge. They're just massive. So we love that one.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying the demand is highest with the podcast, but the ROI is best with the newsletter. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I think like the initial demand is with the podcast, and then if they try a bit of everything, they'll often come back for more with the newsletter.
Interesting. So how are you going? How do you plan to meet that demand going forward? You look at Morning Brew as you say, as the original inspiration. What Morning Brew has done is basically gone into niche verticals in lots of B2B niches and stuff like that. Do you want to nichify the Daily Aus so that you have more inventory and more niche inventory? Like, do you want to launch a sports specific Daily Aus, a politics Daily Aus, a health Daily Aus?
We're thinking about it, and this conversation, comes up a lot, and we just don't feel like we have enough of a dominant position in the market to start splitting that audience up. So, you know, there's a like the NPR equivalent in Australia is called Triple J, and they're young public radio, and they've got 1 million on Instagram alone. So the fact that we only have 500,000 tells me that there's another 500,000 people we need to be getting to, and we can put our rates up there and grow as a business there. But the thing I'm really interested in as well is, and, we haven't made any kind of big moves or anything, but what does the landscape look like in other countries even? Could that be a way, instead of vertically expanding across categories, could there be in fact be demand for this in other countries as well?
Interesting. And over the last few years, but recently especially, a lot of social media platforms have signaled that they really just don't want to be in the news business anymore.
Yeah.
Especially statements from Meta. If you try to search on Threads right now for things like COVID, it just brings you back, absolutely nothing. And obviously, Facebook is completely pivoted away from news. Obviously you've moved a lot of your audience on to these decentralized platforms like podcasts and newsletters. How do you feel about what's going? And then obviously in Australia they passed or threatened to pass this legislation that would force news organizations to or the major tech platforms to pay the news organizations, and then they blocked it. So given that it seems like there's this contentious relationship between news organizations and tech platforms, how does that make you feel as a social first news organization?
It makes me feel nervous. It makes me feel like we need to ensure that we're constantly being nimble as a business and not having too much structure and reliance on one particular platform. So, as you said before, continuing to diversify into newsletter and podcast audiences, but also continuing to strengthen the brand and the brand of the Daily Aus and the colors that we use, and the way that we turn up at music festivals and the way that we turn up at different parts of society, university campuses, means that if we have to go to another platform, people come with us, because there's actually strength in brand. And what I think is missing from this conversation about news organizations on social media is the way that you can still build a strong brand awareness and a strong presence on a particular platform that can be moved to where audiences are. And even with the AI discussions about news, and can't we just get ChatGPT to write these little explainers for us? I know that people are not going to say to ChatGPT, "Can you tell me what's happening in Israel this week?" They're going to say, "I wonder what how the Daily Aus is explaining what's happening in Israel this week." And that's that intellectual property that really is going to survive whatever social media turmoil is in front of us.
Do you do anything to go out and meet your audience?
Heaps, yeah. So we do, we've got this really nice series called Politics in the Pub, which is literally just, we're going to turn up at this pub in this city to talk about. We just had a referendum in Australia. Once in a generation referendum was 4 days ago as we're recording this. And we did a series of Politics in the Pubs events before that, where we'd get, experts, journalists, people with lived experience to come and sit on a panel, have 150 people, shout them a beer, and normalize discussions about news. We need to do a better job. The other really cool way that we show up is music festivals. And I think music festivals is this gold mine of engagement for young people. And we run podcast stages at music festivals. And that's been really successful.
Interesting. So people are going to the music festival and they're seeing some live acts, but they're also seeing some live performances of podcast episodes.
Yeah, well, I most of the music festivals that we go to here with young people, lots of drinking and fun. Music only gets started at 3 p.m. So you need something to do, and you need some shade, and you need to go and chill out. And so we run these podcast stages where everything's recorded, so talent is incentivized to come and do it because they get content out of it. And it's really great place to show up, and it really challenges that idea of news as a stale, old kind of business. Here in Australia, we have 70% of the landscape is owned by two media companies. It is one of the most saturated and least competitive markets in the entire world. And so that impression has built an image of news in young people's minds that it's not for them, it's stale, it's boring, and we're really challenging that.
What's the relationship between you and the music festival? Are they paying you to be there? Are you paying them to be there? Are you getting sponsors specifically for that?
Yeah, often we just work out a deal and say we'll give you some coverage, on the page, and we'll run a giveaway and promote tickets and all that kind of thing. And then maybe we'll cover the branding of the stage, or maybe we'll ensure that there's programming, so that's not something they have to worry about. We just kind of work out deals with. I mean, this is uncharted territory for a lot of the festivals as well, so we just want to make sure that they're getting value out of it. And look, it's not a completely original idea. I mean, there's been speaking tents forever. This is just putting a microphone in front of people and recording it and giving it kind of a sexier twist.
Well, what's the value to you to doing it?
Meeting people who are there not in the context of looking for news at all. They're literally there to go and see, their favorite DJ play. And because we're near the kebab shop, they stumble across us and they go, they're having a discussion about cost of living and housing affordability. I actually find that really interesting because I'm struggling to pay my rent at the moment. I might engage with that a little bit more. These are people who are honestly scared of news, and we're breaking down that image, and it's a smart business decision.
And what kind of discussions or interactions do you have when you're actually meeting these people face to face? Like, is it a lot of podcasters talk about parasocial relationships and what it's like for someone to like listen to you for hours on end with the in their earbuds or whatever. I mean, do you get that kind of feedback? Like, oh my God, like I've been listening to you for the last year. It's so weird to meet you in person or anything like that.
Yeah, and the most common comment we get is, "You're the only thing I read." There is this real sense of, I get what I need from you, which is really great. It's probably not a forever solution for these people. I mean, as they age, they'll develop their understanding of particular issues and expand their news diet. But for a first stage front door into news, to hear somebody say, I didn't read anything before, now I'm reading you every day or listening to you every day, and I really appreciate the fact that you don't make me feel like an idiot, is really rewarding.
I feel like a lot of the aggregators that I follow, they're talking about how they're doing basically arbitrage of like paid audience acquisition, advertising on other newsletters on social media, figuring out what the actual lifetime value of a subscriber and growing that way, especially inquiring like newsletter subscribers, because that's a lot easier to actually figure out, calculate what the lifetime value is. Are you
Sure.
doing any of the paid acquisition?
We have started doing paid acquisition in the last 3 months. So pretty late into the journey. And honestly, it's come from a place of curiosity, and looking at, Matt McGarry and the newsletter operator and those kind of guys on Twitter just talking about how successful those paid acquisition channels can be. So we've been curious and we've tried some stuff and it's working great. I'm still curious to see in 12 months how many of those newsletter readers are still there. And then we were early on board the Beehive train. So I think, and I have to verify with the Beehive guys, but I think we were the first Beehive customer in Australia. Um, and that's because I'm a big follower of Tyler Danks, and I just really like the way that they've modeled out referral programs and how easy it is to swap around newsletter audiences.
So you use their marketplace where you will like basically create customized links, and if someone signs up for your newsletter, you pay out a certain per like $3 per sign up or whatever it is.
I would love to use it. We've never used it, and the reason why we haven't used it is because there's no one else in Australia using it.
So where are you directing your paid acquisition dollars?
At TikTok, Facebook, playing around a little bit with LinkedIn and seeing if we have some efficiencies there. TikTok's the most successful channel for us.
Another thing I notice a lot with these aggregation media outlets is they eventually start seeing kind of diminishing returns in terms of growth. And so a lot of them experiment with doing more original content, hiring reporters, doing kind of more original journalism, because that can be like a lead magnet for subscribers and audience acquisition. Some have been successful with it, some not so successful. What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you want to remain purely kind of like a kind of breezy curator of news, or do you think could you envision a future where you're doing long form journalism pieces or a narrative podcast series or like an actual YouTube show where with
Mm.
episodes and everything like that?
Curation and aggregation for us has always been a product of having low budgets, and having that startup mentality of I'm doing this on my phone on the way to my other job. As we've developed as a company, the focus has shifted totally to how can we be adding to the news landscape. And so we've now got a whole team of journalists who do original stuff. We're breaking stories. We're interviewing some really remarkable talent. I mean, we've had the Prime Minister a number of times on the podcast, and we've filmed that as well. We've had the US Ambassador Caroline Kennedy on as well. Like, we're really trying hard to do the best interviews possible. And we're breaking stories about things that matter to young people. So, vaping regulation in Australia, or calls to mental health helplines going up around particular events. Um, the ways that young people are being able to engage with credit products or crypto, like really trying to hone in on things that matter and telling young stories. And then for podcasting as well, I mean, we did a 4-part series it's been 10 years in Australia since a landmark speech about misogyny in the Australian Parliament by our then Prime Minister, who was the first woman Prime Minister. We wanted to investigate what's happened since then, what's happened in the 10 years since. So we did a limited series there. And then with that referendum I was telling you about, we did a 5-part series for the pod. So we are just getting started. And I think, whether it's international travel now to go actually to report on live news, all that kind of stuff, we're never going to lose our North Star of explaining what's happening. But sometimes to explain what's happening, you need to go and ask them.
How big is your staff now?
We've now got 18 full timers. They're all under 32. The youngest is 20, and it's a thriving news. And we've captured that newsroom, the one that my dad was in 30 years ago. We've captured that vibe. It's journalists working with their editors side by side. We really discourage remote work. It's all about being in the office and really feeding off each other. The most interesting staff member is that we are one of the only organizations in Australia to have a full-time fact checker. So aside from our editors and aside from the deputy editors and all those kind of people, we have a full-time fact checker to make sure that what we say is correct.
And what's kind of like the rough breakdown of like editorial versus business side?
So we've got 2 salespeople, 1 tech person, 1 growth person, and the rest is all editorial.
Nice. And like,
Yeah.
what would you, when you look ahead 2 years from now, what do you think you're going to be doing then that you're not doing now?
I'd want to see us be in a position where we are undeniably the dominant player in youth media in Australia, and still capturing in 2 years from now the 18-year-olds then. So they're currently 16. How are we talking to them, that new audience? And then I want to see us really try and tease out and explore international opportunities to see whether there is a global market for it. And whether the fact that nobody has really given hard news for young people a crack means that we're barking up the wrong tree and it's not actually a viable business, or that we just haven't had an organization brave enough to see it through.
Okay, Sam, those are all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
So they can find us at the Daily Aus on Instagram, or thedailyos.com.au, which I know is a bit of a change from your normal plugs for guests to have a .au at the end, but .au. And also a quick shout out that Zara and I are going to be in the US for a couple of weeks in November. And we're really keen to meet everybody and to explore what the pinnacle of media is, which is the US market.
Okay, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Simon.